I haven't heard that story in ages.
It feels like yesterday we were just starting out.
All right, everyone, let's make this a good one. Ready?
1, 2, 3. I'm done, Ray. I can't do this anymore.
Mom, what's going on?
The man we trusted was never the man we thought we knew.
Do you know what happened?
I heard there was trouble. Let's step back.
Some people spend their entire lives trying to be remembered for the love they gave. Others make one final decision that forever changes how they're remembered. This is one of those stories. At first, it looks like the heartbreaking end of a relationship. A woman finds the courage to walk away from the men she once believed would help rebuild her life after years of pain. Friends saw them smiling together. Neighbors believed they had found happiness. Even her children thought he was the answer to prayers they had quietly whispered after watching their mother survive a painful divorce. But sometimes the people who appear to bring peace into our lives are carrying storms no one else can see. Sometimes the most devastating wounds aren't left by strangers, but by the people we trusted enough to welcome into our homes. What happened inside one ordinary American house on an otherwise ordinary Sunday afternoon would leave a family asking questions that still echo years later. It wasn't simply the loss that shattered them. It was the way it happened. It was the silence that came before it. And it was the terrifying realization that one final act could become a lifetime of unwanted memories. When 21-year-old Ethan Carter looks back on his childhood home today, he doesn't remember birthday parties, holiday dinners, or the sound of laughter filling the living room. He remembers the day that home stopped feeling like home forever. He remembers the phone call that changed everything. He remembers hearing the pain in his mother's voice, a sound he had only heard once before when his biological father nearly took his own life years earlier. That scream stayed with him then, and it returned to haunt him again in a way no son should ever have to experience. The man at the center of this story wasn't Ethan's biological father. His name was Ray Collins, and for years almost everyone believed he was exactly the kind of man Ethan's mother deserved. Kind. Reliable. Charming. Patient. The sort of man who seemed capable of healing a family that had already survived more heartbreak than most people experience in a lifetime. But appearances can be dangerously convincing, and by the time the truth revealed itself, the damage had already been done. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What makes this story unforgettable isn't only the tragedy that unfolded inside that house. It's the long chain of choices, warning signs, and quiet moments that led there. Because if you had met Ray during those early years, you probably would have liked him too. And that may be the most unsettling part of all. If there is one question that still refuses to leave Ethan Carter's mind, it isn't what happened that Sunday afternoon. It's what happened during the years before it. How could a man who once seemed so thoughtful, dependable, and caring become the very person his family feared? Was the man they welcomed into their home ever real, or had they simply fallen in love with a version of him that never truly existed? Those questions have lingered far longer than the tragedy itself, because the hardest part of looking back isn't remembering the ending. It's realizing how many moments suddenly make sense once you already know how the story ends. To understand why Ethan speaks about Ray Collins without a single ounce of sympathy, you first have to understand the family Ray stepped into. Ethan's mother, Laura Carter, had already survived one painful chapter. Years earlier, she had fought through a difficult marriage that ended after alcoholism consumed the men she once loved. Instead of allowing that experience to define her, Laura focused every ounce of her energy on raising her two sons. Ethan was determined, protective, and preparing for adulthood, while his younger brother, Noah Carter, required extra care because of his learning disabilities. Their home wasn't perfect, but it was filled with resilience. Every dollar Laura earned was stretched to provide stability, every family dinner reminded the boys they were never facing life's challenges alone, and every birthday, holiday, and vacation became proof that happiness could still exist after heartbreak. They had become the kind of family that survived by standing together. Then Ray entered their lives. At first, everything seemed to fall into place. He remembered birthdays without being reminded. He offered to help around the house before anyone asked. He made Laura laugh in ways Ethan hadn't seen since before his parents' divorce. Friends admired them together. Neighbors smiled whenever they saw the couple leaving for dinner. Family photographs captured genuine smiles. Holiday gatherings felt warm again. Looking through those pictures today, nothing appears unusual. You see a family rebuilding. You see hope replacing pain. You see a man who looked as though he genuinely cared for the people standing beside him. That's what makes this story so difficult to understand. Because every memory from those early years seems to tell one story, while everything that followed tells another. Looking back now, Ethan often wonders whether the warning signs had always been there, quietly hidden inside ordinary moments nobody thought twice about. A sharp comment disguised as a joke. A disagreement that lasted a little longer than it should have. A look across the room that seemed harmless until viewed through the lens of everything that came later. One by one, those moments would eventually connect into a picture the family never saw while they were living it. And by the time they finally understood what they had been looking at all along, it was already too late. The hardest lessons in life rarely arrive all at once. They come quietly, hidden inside ordinary days that seem too normal to question. Looking back, Ethan Carter often wished there had been one obvious moment when someone could have stood up and warned his family to turn around while they still had the chance. But life doesn't usually work that way. The people who leave the deepest scars don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive carrying flowers, telling jokes around the dinner table, fixing broken cabinets, and making children believe their mother has finally found the happiness she deserves. That was the version of Ray Collins everyone came to know, and for a long time, there was no reason to believe he was anything else. After surviving years of emotional exhaustion from her first marriage, Laura Carter had reached a place where simply making it through each day felt like an accomplishment. Raising two boys on her own wasn't easy. Ethan was preparing for college and dreaming about building a future that would make his mother proud. Noah depended on Laura's constant care and patience, making every decision she faced even more important. There were bills to pay, doctor's appointments to attend, school events to organize, and countless sacrifices that no one outside the family ever noticed. Yet through all of it, Laura remained the steady foundation that held everyone together. She rarely complained. She simply kept moving forward, hoping that one day life might become a little lighter. Then Ray appeared. At first, he seemed to become that answer. He never rushed his way into the family. Instead, he earned his place one thoughtful gesture at a time. He remembered the little things that mattered. He offered to repair things around the house before Laura even asked. He laughed easily with Ethan, treated Noah with patience and kindness, and took Laura out on simple dinner dates that reminded her she was more than just a hard-working single mother. Holidays felt brighter. Family dinners became louder with laughter. Weekend outings slowly became traditions. Friends admired how naturally Ray blended into their lives, and even Ethan found himself grateful that someone was finally helping carry the weight his mother had carried alone for so many years. It didn't feel like an outsider had entered their home. It felt as though a missing piece of the family had finally arrived. But trust isn't usually broken in one dramatic moment. It fades through small moments so ordinary they're easy to dismiss. A harmless joke that left Laura unusually quiet. A sharp response disguised as frustration after a long day. A suggestion about how money should be handled that sounded responsible rather than controlling. An opinion delivered with enough confidence that no one thought to question it. Each incident, by itself, seemed too small to matter. Together, they were quietly changing the atmosphere inside the Carter home. No one noticed because the good days still outnumbered the difficult ones, and whenever tension appeared, Ray always seemed to know exactly what to say to smooth everything over. Looking back, Ethan realizes the family wasn't ignoring warning signs because they didn't care. They simply believed they were watching an ordinary relationship face ordinary challenges. But the day Ray officially moved into their home marked the beginning of something none of them could yet understand. From that moment on, life inside those walls slowly began to change. The most dangerous relationships rarely collapse overnight. They change so gradually that by the time the damage becomes impossible to ignore, the person living through it has already spent months, or even years, adjusting to a new version of normal. That's exactly what happened inside the Carter home. There was no single argument that changed everything. No dramatic moment that made Ethan look at Ray Collins and immediately see a different man. Instead, the kindness that had earned everyone's trust slowly gave way to criticism, and the warmth that once made Laura Carter feel safe became increasingly difficult to find. The man who had once brought peace into their lives now seemed to create tension wherever he went, yet somehow, every conflict ended with Laura wondering if she could have handled things differently. The arguments became more frequent, but they were never about anything that seemed important at first. A simple conversation over dinner could suddenly become an hour-long disagreement. A family gathering would end with Laura quietly apologizing for something she hadn't intended to do. Friends occasionally noticed Ray making comments that embarrassed her in public, only for him to brush them off as harmless jokes when anyone looked uncomfortable. Laura would smile politely, trying to move the conversation forward, while Ethan quietly wondered why the men who once treated his mother with such respect now seemed determined to challenge her over the smallest issues. Whenever the tension reached a breaking point, Ray would return to the thoughtful man everyone remembered. He would bring flowers, apologize with convincing sincerity, plan a special evening, or promise that things would be different from now on. For a little while, they always were. Then the cycle quietly began again. As time passed, the problems reached beyond arguments. Ray became increasingly involved in Laura's finances, questioning how money was spent and making decisions that slowly left her with fewer options than before. Conversations about bills, savings, and household expenses turned into disagreements that always seemed to end with Laura making another compromise. She wasn't someone who avoided difficult conversations. Anyone who knew Laura understood she was independent, determined, and more than capable of standing her ground. But loving someone often means believing they can change if you're patient enough. She wasn't weak. She was trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. She suggested counseling. She arranged therapy sessions. She encouraged honest conversations, hoping a professional could help them rebuild what was falling apart. Ray attended, but each session ended the same way. Responsibility always belonged to someone else. Reflection never lasted beyond the therapist's office, and promises made during counseling quietly disappeared once they returned home. Eventually, the emotional distance inside the house became impossible to ignore. Laura no longer felt comfortable sharing the same bedroom. She began sleeping in Ethan's old room after he left for college, locking the door before going to bed each night. That simple act said more than any argument ever could. A woman who had survived years of hardship now felt safer behind a locked door inside her own home. Ethan would later realize that by this point, the relationship was no longer about saving a future together. It was about finding a safe way to leave. Then, after countless second chances, broken promises, and exhausting attempts to make the relationship work, Sunday finally arrived. Laura looked at Ray with a calmness that surprised even herself and spoke the words she had spent months preparing to say. "I'm done." Neither she nor her sons could have imagined how those two words would change their lives forever. There are certain days that begin so quietly you could never imagine they will divide your life into two parts, everything that came before, and everything that comes after. For the Carter family, that day arrived on an ordinary Sunday. The sun rose just as it always had. Cars passed through the neighborhood. People went about their routines without the slightest idea that, inside one house, a family was standing on the edge of a moment that would forever redefine what the word home meant. Looking back, Ethan Carter has often wondered whether there was anything that morning that could have changed the outcome. A different conversation. A different decision. One more chance. But some questions never receive answers, and some endings begin long before anyone realizes the final chapter has already been written. Laura Carter had reached a place emotionally where there was nothing left to negotiate. She had spent months trying to rescue a relationship that seemed determined to pull her deeper into exhaustion. She had offered understanding, patience, counseling, forgiveness, and countless opportunities to start over. That morning, she calmly packed a few belongings for herself and Noah. There was no anger in her actions anymore, only quiet determination. She planned to leave the house for a short while, giving Ray Collins one final opportunity to collect his things and leave peacefully. When she returned, she hoped the house would finally belong to her family again. Ray asked one last question. Was there anything he could do to change her mind? Laura looked at him with the honesty that had guided every difficult decision she had ever made and simply answered, no. It wasn't spoken with hatred. It was spoken with acceptance. The relationship had reached its end. What happened next unfolded with a silence that now feels almost impossible to explain. Ray didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make promises or plead for another chance. His calmness should have brought relief, yet later it became one of the details Laura replayed over and over in her mind. She and Noah left the house believing they were creating space for a peaceful ending. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the difficult part was finally behind them. When they returned, Laura expected to walk into an empty living room and begin rebuilding the life she had fought so hard to protect. Instead, she stepped into a moment that words have never been able to fully capture. The house fell into a silence unlike any she had ever known, followed by a scream that neighbors would remember long after the police cars disappeared from the street. Within minutes, flashing lights surrounded the Carter home. Officers hurried inside while neighbors stood frozen behind closed curtains and front lawns, trying to understand what had happened. News spread quickly through the quiet neighborhood, but no rumor could prepare Ethan for the phone call he received. The moment he heard his mother's voice, he recognized something that reached far beyond grief. Years earlier, when his biological father had attempted to take his own life, Ethan had heard the same unbearable cry. It was the sound of someone witnessing a moment no human heart should ever have to carry. Hearing it again shattered something inside him. In that instant, life before that Sunday disappeared forever. Yet as devastating as that afternoon was, the event itself wasn't the only thing that stayed with the Carter family. Long after the police left, after relatives gathered around Laura and Noah, and after the neighborhood slowly returned to its normal routine, another battle was only beginning. Because what haunted their family wasn't simply what happened inside that house that day. It was everything that came afterward, when the silence finally settled in. The hardest part of surviving a tragedy isn't always the day it happens. Sometimes the real battle begins after everyone else goes home. After the police tape is removed, the phone stops ringing, the casseroles stop arriving, and the world quietly returns to normal, the people left behind are expected to somehow keep living. For the Carter family, the loss itself wasn't what broke them most deeply. It was what remained after it. The empty rooms. The unanswered questions. The memories that refused to stay in the past. While friends and neighbors spoke about moving forward, Laura Carter was learning that healing isn't a straight path. Some nights she could almost convince herself she was going to be okay. Other nights, all it took was closing her eyes for the memories to return with heartbreaking clarity. The house that had once been filled with birthday celebrations, holiday dinners, and the laughter of two growing boys no longer felt like the place Laura had spent years protecting. Every hallway carried a reminder she never asked to keep. Every familiar room became connected to the worst day of her life. Sleep became something she feared almost as much as she needed. When exhaustion finally won, nightmares often followed. She would wake suddenly, heart racing, only to realize she was safe in her own bed. But safety and peace are not always the same thing. Noah struggled in his own quiet way, trying to understand a tragedy no child should ever have to process. Ethan carried a different burden. He wasn't there that afternoon, yet he found himself replaying everything he wished he could have done differently, even knowing there was nothing he could have changed. Grief has a way of convincing good people that impossible responsibilities somehow belonged to them all along. As the emotional wound settled in, another reality arrived that few people ever talk about. Alongside heartbreak came unexpected financial burdens. Instead of being allowed to focus entirely on healing, Laura was suddenly faced with expenses she never imagined she would have to carry. Bills continued arriving. Household responsibilities didn't pause. The practical realities of rebuilding a life refused to wait for grief to become easier. Adding to the pain was the silence Ray Collins left behind. There was no farewell to his son living in another state. No explanation. No apology. No letter offering even the smallest sense of closure. The questions that had haunted the family remained unanswered, leaving Laura and her sons to search for meaning where none had been given. In many ways, it felt as though they had been handed the responsibility of carrying a burden they never chose. Yet even in the middle of unimaginable pain, something remarkable began happening. Family members refused to let Laura face the darkness alone. Friends surrounded her with practical help, encouragement, and unwavering support. Therapy became part of the family's new routine, not because healing was quick, but because healing was possible. Week after week, small victories slowly replaced overwhelming despair. They weren't dramatic changes that happened overnight. They were quiet moments almost too small to notice. Then one evening, during a conversation with Ethan, Laura shared something that neither of them would ever forget. She paused for a long moment before softly saying, "The other night, I was getting ready to sleep, and I realized I was thinking about something else before bed." She smiled through tears, almost surprised by her own words. I think that's progress. It wasn't the end of her pain. It wasn't the disappearance of every painful memory. But for the first time since that Sunday afternoon, hope had quietly found its way back into a heart that had every reason to stop believing tomorrow could be better. Some stories leave us searching for someone to hate. Others leave us searching for something much harder to understand. As Ethan Carter looked back over everything his family had endured, he realized this story was never simply about one terrible Sunday or one heartbreaking decision. It was about the countless ordinary days that came before it. The quiet compromises. The excuses. The promises that sounded sincere. The hope that tomorrow would somehow be different. Looking back, it's easy to connect the pieces. Living through them is something else entirely. That's why so many people find themselves trapped in unhealthy relationships without realizing just how much of themselves they've slowly given away. The warning signs rarely arrive all at once. They appear one conversation at a time, one apology at a time, one broken promise at a time, until the life he once recognized feels strangely unfamiliar. Ethan has often been asked whether he misses Ray Collins. His answer has surprised many people. He doesn't miss Ray. But he does miss the man he believed Ray was during those first years. He misses the person who made his mother laugh again, who seemed patient with Noah, who made family dinners feel complete, and who convinced everyone that brighter days had finally arrived. Whether that version of Ray ever truly existed is a question Ethan still cannot answer. Perhaps it was genuine for a time. Perhaps it was the version Ray wanted the world to see. Or perhaps the truth was more complicated than anyone outside that home could ever fully understand. What Ethan knows for certain is that the memories he treasures from those early days now exist beside memories he wishes his family had never been forced to carry. This story also reminds us that emotional abuse often leaves no visible scars, making it incredibly difficult for others to recognize. Control doesn't always begin with shouting or threats. Sometimes it begins with isolation disguised as protection, criticism disguised as honesty, or financial decisions presented as responsibility. By the time loved ones notice something is wrong, the person living through it may already feel exhausted, confused, and unsure of their own judgment. That is why compassion matters so much. Leaving an unhealthy relationship can be one of the most dangerous and emotionally overwhelming moments a person ever experiences. Survivors deserve support, patience, and the reassurance that asking for help is never a sign of weakness. Laura Carter's courage wasn't found in enduring years of pain. It was found in deciding she and her children deserved a safer future, even when making that decision came with enormous uncertainty. Today, the Carter family continues moving forward one day at a time. The pain hasn't disappeared completely, but it no longer controls every moment of their lives. Healing hasn't erased the past. It has simply given them the strength to keep writing new chapters beyond it. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson this story leaves behind. We cannot always choose what happens to us, but we can choose how we care for one another afterward. We can learn to recognize warning signs earlier. We can listen more carefully when someone tells us they're struggling. And we can remind those living through difficult relationships that they are never as alone as they may feel. As this chapter comes to a close, one question remains that Ethan still asks himself from time to time: how different would our lives have been if we'd recognized the warning signs sooner? Some stories end with justice. Others end with answers. But every once in a while, a story ends by leaving us with questions that stay in our minds long after the screen goes dark. The Carter family's journey isn't one that can be measured by court records, headlines, or a single heartbreaking afternoon. It's measured by the quiet courage it took to wake up each morning after everything changed. It's measured by every therapy session that felt too difficult to attend but happened anyway. It's measured by every family dinner where laughter slowly found its way back into a home that once felt impossible to return to. And it's measured by a mother who refused to let the worst day of her life become the final chapter of her story. If there's one thing Ethan Carter hopes people take away from sharing his family's experience, it's that healing is possible, even when it feels unimaginably far away. It may not happen quickly, and it may never erase every painful memory, but it can slowly restore hope where despair once lived. Perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't always the event itself. Sometimes it's realizing how many warning signs were misunderstood because they looked ordinary at the time. A controlling comment mistaken for concern. An apology accepted because it sounded sincere. A promise believed because love wanted to believe it. Looking back, those moments appear much clearer than they ever did while they were happening. That's why stories like this matter. They remind us to pay closer attention, to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, and to support the people around us when they find the courage to speak about what they're experiencing. We may never know every thought that crossed Ray Collins' mind during those final hours, and perhaps some questions will never be answered. But what we do know is that one family's determination to keep moving forward has become a powerful reminder that even the deepest emotional wounds do not have to define the rest of a person's life. Now we'd love to hear your thoughts. If you were in Laura Carter's position, do you think you would have recognized the warning signs any sooner? Is there anything you would have done differently if you had been facing the same situation? Share your perspective respectfully in the comments below. Your experience or advice could encourage someone who may be quietly struggling today. Every story teaches us something, and every voice has the power to help someone else feel less alone. Some scars never completely disappear. But healing isn't forgetting. Healing is choosing to keep living, choosing to love again, and choosing not to let yesterday steal tomorrow. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another true story that deserves to be told. In our next documentary, we'll uncover another real-life story where appearances hit a devastating truth, proving once again that the lives people show the world often reveal only a small part of the story they're really living. Until next time, stay safe, take care of the people you love, and thank you for watching.